Hello and welcome to this session in the World Economic Forum on the path to sustainable growth. I'm Stephanie Flanders, I'm Head of Economics and Government at Bloomberg, and we're here to discuss, as you heard in that video, some of the, not just the extraordinary developments that we've seen over the last few years and how they've affected the path to sustainable growth, but also solutions. We always try to be solutions focused in these sessions, and I think this is a time, speaking as someone who has a team of economists but also economic and political reporters working across the globe at Bloomberg, what we see more and more is this shift from a long period of globalization in which we saw income inequality between countries actually fall to a historic degree, but also inequality within countries increase, and often the path to inclusive growth become more challenging. Now, and that was in a period where you had relatively benign geopolitical conditions, falling costs, increased economic integration, we now have a lot of those trends going into reverse. We have fragmentation economically and politically around the world. We have wars, hot wars in several places that are also impeding integration. And above all of that, and very prominent in that video, we have climate change, not just directly threatening the public finances and the economic and social conditions of some of the poorest countries in the world, but I would say also clearly seriously affecting conditions for ordinary people and for the poorest most of all. So all of that seems worse than ironic in a sense, because as we also saw in that video, there's one trend that has not reversed in the last few years, and that's the path of innovation and technology. And everything else being equal, which it never is, though we're going to have a panel of economists here who like to assume other things are equal, but other things equal, you would have expected that technology to throw up new solutions and show us new paths to sustainable growth. So I hope that we will be digging those out today with this excellent panel, even as we understand the very real challenges facing the world. Let me introduce these three women who are both accomplished economists and practitioners wielding power in their respective institutions, which is not always the combination you have together. Sometimes it's a dangerous combination, but I think in this case of these three it won't be. Immediately to my right we have Esther Dweck, who is the Minister for Management and Innovation in Public Services in Brazil. You have the unenviable task of having to deal with all the public servants in Brazil, and we know they're not necessarily very easy to deal with, so you've been given a tough job. We have Minister Rania Al-Mashat, who is the Minister for International Cooperation of Egypt, but also a very accomplished macroeconomist, literally wrote the book on stakeholder engagement and economic diplomacy, so we'll hear more about that in a minute. And Vera Songwe, who is Chair of the Board of the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility in the UK, but also a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute Africa Growth Initiative. Welcome to all of you. I barely know where to start, but I know we're all sitting in this week of meetings in New York, trying to avoid the traffic jams to try and come up with solutions. A lot of clearly a lot of concern and nervousness around the current situation in the world with war and conflict. Fragmenting us more and more, it seems, day by day. I mean, Vera, just to start with you, how do we keep the focus on sustainable growth and show that there is a path to that, even with all that's going on?
Now, I think two things. One, part of what is going on is because we have not kept the focus on growth and development. And so essentially, if we were able to deliver prosperity, if we were able to deliver a livable planet, if people saw their futures looking much better than the past, we will probably not be seeing a hotter world in the conflict space. But the hotter world in the climate space is because we had such a huge drive to improve our futures, and prosperity came because of the light bulb. Right? And today we're saying we need to continue to create the light bulb, but we can do it differently. And so I think the question is, how do we do the prosperity for the future in a way that is more sustainable. And that, I think, if we were able to do in a way that was more inclusive, and one of the terms that we use these days is green industrialization. And green industrialization, we have just come out of a period where, with a crisis, supply chains that had been very sort of almost monolithic now need to be distributed. If we seriously distributed those supply chains and had some of the production processes happening in the places where incomes are the lowest, I think we will see rising incomes at equally the same levels. We must sort of, the income differentials today are so large that the tensions are almost inbuilt. And you know, there's the conversation about, is this generation going to be wealthier than the generation that came before them? I think the fantastic thing about the climate crisis is that it's also an innovation crisis. And we have seen that with the IRA. We've seen that with Brazil is a leader, and you're going to talk about this. But I think what Brazil has been able to do, and what Egypt is doing, and Kenya and many other countries, is to show that you can actually grow and grow green, and actually faster. And as Africa was able to leapfrog with, you know, banking accounts, we can do that with climate. But for that, we need a global environment, a multilateral environment, where the regulatory framework is transparent, is equitable, and WTO rules need to work so that, you know, we don't have trade distortions in the process.
Well, just to pick up on that briefly, I mean, we have, all of that was sounding optimistic, I mean, sounding positive and pragmatic, except the last bit, because you just feel that the WTO is no longer an institution which is able to underpin that kind of global transparency and approach to trade anymore. So is that, I mean, that piece of it, are we going to have to rethink? Is there a potential replacement for the kind of international norms that were brought by the WTO?
I think the head of the WTO, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, is working really hard to see whether, you know, she's done a pilot case with the fisheries sector. And as we know, half of the world's women depend on fisheries. Fisheries is an important part of mega business, but also small businesses. In Africa, 23 countries, low-income citizens depend on fisheries for their income. So it's a very important part of the global economy. But also, if we do fishing sustainably, then we're saving the ocean. So it brings together the whole conversation. And I think that if we're able to successfully have a protocol on fisheries inside the WTO and get the ratification, maybe we begin to see what a different kind of WTO post, I think China joining, post, you know, in this new age of the fourth industrial revolution, you know, can deliver. And I think it can deliver something that is much more equitable and keep the multilateral system working. It does not have to be a contentious system where, you know, when you don't agree, you walk away. Because I think today, as we speak, we probably have the highest number of export bans across the world. I mean, we saw it with COVID, we're seeing it with rice production in some parts of the world than we have ever seen before. And that is what is also impacting growth, because it is the poor that suffer the most when you have these export bans and all. The rich can always access expensive goods from someplace else. And so WTO remains important, but we need a different kind of maybe regulatory voting rights system around the WTO and a different set of people around the table than they were when the WTO was created.
Well, Esther, actually, just to bring you in, I mean, we've already mentioned Brazil and the possible paths to greener growth. I guess there's been quite a lot of paths to growth in Brazil, not all of them as green as others, but there's certainly a lot of innovation there. But also, to pick up on that last point, I mean, is there an extra impetus but also an extra space for Brazil and other important emerging market economies to stake their claim on this territory?
Actually, I do think they are. And I think when Vera was speaking, I was thinking about it, that when we had, like, after the second post-war, post the Second World War, we had, like, this kind of international forum to discuss how the world could move forward in order to have a better prosperity for all the world. But at that time, most than two-thirds of the countries were either colonies or were still in a period of decolonization. And we saw that this was very important for the developed countries, that they were able to actually have a period of prosperity, of sharing profits, sharing the incomes within their countries, and this changed by the 80s and 90s. And now I think we're in the same period that we need to rethink the global development growth, I think. You know, Viro has mentioned how we should actually spread out the production out all over the world, so have decent jobs all over the world. So I think now, if every country every country is trying to do it by itself, also, and in this period also the developed countries, which actually brings also a competition that it's not really fair sometimes. When you see, she mentioned IRA compared to the Brazilians, if you see the numbers are completely different. So. But I think this is why she mentioned about the international forum. I think all the multilateral institutions are in some way need to rethink themselves. I think this is something that Brazil is pushing a lot. Even our G20 presidency and in President Lula's speech in the Assembly, he's mentioned this. We need a new global forum in order to discuss these things, and all the countries should have their moment. Brazil, of course, compared to other countries, especially in Africa, it's in a different level. In Africa, we have many different countries. So, of course, we know the South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya, they're similar to Brazil in terms of perspective, and Egypt as well. But we do see that if we do by them ourselves, and we don't take into account all the region, for example, the Latin American region or the South American region, we still have problems with our neighbors, and we'll not be able to grow more steadily. So I think this is something that they have to take into account. But according to the Brazilian, just to mention something that Vira mentioned, what we're trying to do now is to have what we call an ecological transformation. It's not only going green, but it's ecological in terms of using bioeconomy, so reforesting, and reforesting as a productive situation, not only by reforesting because we need to reforest, but also to use the forest as a source of gaining income for the people who live there, learning from actually the people who live in the indigenous people, the traditional community, how they were able to survive many years using the forest. So we are trying to learn with that. Going to push for our energy transition as well. Brazil has, in terms of electricity, 80% of renewable or green, but we still have a lot of fuels. We have a very important oil company that's it's trying to push also energy transition. So we are moving towards this path. And I think this is important for Brazil itself, of course, but if you don't look at the other countries, we still be having trouble in a very few periods, very few years. So I think it's something that we have to think globally.
And how important, I mean, we obviously are talking a lot about international cooperation, and this is a week for international cooperation or talk about it. But you also, in a country like Brazil, you also have to make it work for the population. Yes. After a period of very fractious politics and very deeply seated divides, regional and political. So, what's been your experience of just trying to build those coalitions and get people on side, even for the kind of growth path that you were just talking about, which a lot of people will consider to be a threat to their livelihood?
Exactly. I think the government, President Lula, has the words of union and reconstruction, because we are politically polarized a lot in Brazil, and still it is. So we are trying to see how can you see that prosperity for everyone and everyone to be aligned with this. And I think part of the political division that we have is based on that we're not able to have everyone on board. So you see some people just trying to fight for their means, how to survive. So what we're trying to do is to show that and that's why management and innovation, why President Lula decided to create this ministry. It's a new one, because he sees that the state has to have an important role. So we have to reconstruct, to build, and I think this is not only in Brazil, but other countries as well. The state cannot be switched on and switched off. So if you try to have COVID, for instance, and say, okay, now the state has to come in. But if you don't have the instruments, if you don't know how to use their policies, then you'll not be able to do it. And what we're trying to do is to have, for instance, President Lula, in his first mandate, his main goal was to fight hunger in Brazil. By 2014, we had, in terms of statistically, we had no hunger in Brazil. But now when he came back to power, we had 33 million in hunger. Mm. And then we have to, and the policies were there, but they were not being used properly. So we had to switch. For instance, the Bolsa Família, which is a very important program in Brazil, was completely turned off. And the main instruments they had. Last year, we were able to rebuild it, and 21 million people were out of the extreme hunger. So this was very important. So you have many instruments that you can use, but you have to use properly, and you have to be in a coalition also, the politically, in order to approve this in the Congress. So just to mention this very quickly, that as we have a presidential political, we have our president, but the Congress, of course, is very strong, and the party of the president has very small deputies and senators. So we are trying to actually to involve all the congressmen and women in order to show them that we need to have this new development path in order to have a better, not only growth, but also prosperity for the community, in order to reduce what for us is the most important thing is the threat of democracy because of the political polarization. So we're trying to put all the Democrats, either from left parties or the right parties or center, in order to say, if you don't have a strategy that actually you take into consideration the inequalities in Brazil, the most vulnerable, and especially the black people in Brazil, the women and the indigenous people, then we'll not be able to actually have a solid democracy in order to have a better development path.
Rania Al-Mashat, we've talked already about sort of different alliances and countries facing the sort of costs and benefits of a more fragmented world. When you come, I know you're not only representing Egypt, you represent many things, but as a country like Egypt, when you come to a week like this in New York, you know, what is it? Is there a new aspect to your role or the responsibility you have to be pushing these kind of solutions?
Well, let me first say that this is my first UNGA as Minister of Planning, Economic Development and International Cooperation. So there's an additional aspect to coming here, which is in addition to partnerships, how can you leverage these partnerships and agreements to actually push economic development? We had the Compact of the Future agreed a few days ago. There was, it wasn't an easy process for those who were negotiating the document. But in the midst of a world where multilateralism is being tested and talked about and doubted, it's good that we have a draft where everybody agreed on. And when we take a deeper look at it, you find that in order to achieve the SDGs by 2030, there is a need to reform certain things in the international financial, global financial architecture. And this is very important because it ties with the climate question and it ties with creating jobs question in a time when geopolitics globally is affecting emerging markets in a very, very urgent way. And let me maybe elaborate a bit. Cost of borrowing is growing. Foreign exchange earning in many cases is less than before given the higher risk that is being faced. And as we are telling countries we need to do climate action, crowd in and blend private sector investments, you actually need to do that by bringing down their risk. So there's a challenge in time. You want to bring in the private sector, but at the same time, it's where risks are heightened. So here comes the idea of, and this has been debated and discussed, how can international financial institutions allow more concessional finance, maybe through the SDRs. So this is one very lively discussion, and it's also mentioned in the compact. The second idea is as we are moving into more renewable energy in order to increase the energy mix to meet the climate ambitions, this is an opportunity for countries. But in order for that to take place, also blending it with more concessional is much needed. The other element is related to debt sustainability analysis. As you are looking in the world today, where you need to do most of the investments for renewable energy, these are the places that have higher indebtedness. So there is that discussion that is happening here this week, and I think will continue through annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank in Washington. How can we address the indebtedness of countries in order to bring in the private investments to allow sustainable economic growth? And here let me say sustainable and inclusive, since we want to reach an equitable path. There's also the climate ambition across countries. is creating a tilt away from a level playing field. And let me take, for instance, IRA was mentioned. So here, yes, there's very important subsidies provided here in the US, but they also mean that in other countries, it's crowding out investments. You take a look at Europe also, there are many policies which are trying to push for competitiveness there, but at the same time, it pushes other countries into a disadvantage. So as much as in your opening remarks you said that globalization pushed for more equity between countries,
not within.
But, yeah, but now you're seeing that that is actually being pushed further away. So these are very important questions. They have immediate implications on the public, and if we're talking in World Bank evolution language, identifying global public goods. Global public good at the end of the day is, in my view, a citizen that is able to find a job, do well, add to the economic growth of his own country or her own country, and therefore global growth is better. So if each one of us is seen, if people are seen as global public goods, then everything we are discussing here is at the end of the day trying to achieve that, not just for the good at a national level, but at a global level. And maybe one final thought, and this is something that I've been discussing with colleagues and everyone I meet. Our focus on achieving the SDGs by 2030, as much as they are important, and put a common denominator across all countries, I think we need to engage a little bit more in discussion of economic policy. The economic policy towards growth, towards employment, and not just the quantitative indicator of the SDG. They've been extremely helpful in pointing us in our different strategies, but I think with the different industrial policies that are being done in different countries, the discussion of economic policy trade-offs, how can we move forward, I think is very, very urgent.
I mean, there's so much in what you said about you started with the sort of climate challenge, but also mentioned debt, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and international public goods. Just to come back on the way you frame the conversations here this week, it does feel like it's sort of embedded in that was an admission that perhaps in the earlier days or in the last few years in some of the debates in COP and elsewhere, we'd overstated what the private sector could do in the early stages of developing country transitions. And we have had this incredibly disappointing experience so far with the Just Energy partnerships, which really have so far absorbed a lot of time in places like Indonesia and South Africa and not made very much progress. So do you think that was, in retrospect, overstated and we're now sort of trying to do a course correction?
I believe that the discussion on private sector is extremely important. The only thing, as your introductory remark said, everything else equal, but everything else is not equal. If we were from Glasgow till Baku without any international shocks, without any wars, I think you would have seen more private investments going into the energy transition in different countries. The JETPs is a process, and it's in Egypt we try to do our own JETP, which is a nexus of water, food and energy, a country platform that has energy projects, so mitigation is there, but also has food security, water security. And we've been very successful in bringing in concessional finance, grants components. The projects have become bankable, and the lesson here is that it has to be country-led. There has to be commitment from the country. This debate about you're not ready with bankable projects, you need to be clear with your projects, and then finally you have to have credibility with the international community so that they can work together and actually deliver on your, help you deliver on your climate ambitions. So it's not all that unsuccessful. It needs to really be country-led with leveraging the different partnerships. But we cannot escape that countries on their own cannot do it. Private sector has to be there. But it's a time when cost of investment is high, uncertainty is high, and another important aspect is as you are trying to create a stable macroeconomic environment to crowd in the private sector, Sometimes it comes at a cost of subsidy reforms and fiscal austerity, which means higher inflation. So there's no silver bullet. As a policymaker, you have to weigh all these trade-offs and give a very predictable and well understood narrative to be able to crowd in the types of investments that are needed for the climate transition. But climate transition is important for economic growth. If you don't have energy security, you do not have economic growth. That is a fact.
I'm encouraging if anybody wants to come back. I also want to say anyone who's watching who wants to share anything around this or other aspects of the meeting, it's hashtag SDIM24. Vera, just to come back or just to sort of continue the conversation around climate, I mean, particularly in Africa, which I know is a big area of expertise for you, what the concern that I have heard from a lot of people in what you might call the traditional development community, I mean, people who've been working for years on debt reduction, on development assistance, feel that climate has just ended up, when you talk about crowding out, that in the donor community and elsewhere, it has ended up crowding out potentially much more immediately impactful development assistance. Is that something you worry about, or is it based on a kind of misunderstanding?
I think
obviously the two go together. But,
the two go together. I think two things are happening, and Rania said something, and I think we talked a little bit about it. I think globally, what we are seeing in the conversations, first maybe from equity and the multilateral system, is that there has been a substantial drop in international aid. And so essentially what we're trying to do with sort of the international concessional resources is do a lot more with a lot less. And so if you start from that premise, then any country, Egypt included, Brazil, that is looking for additional concessional long-term funding, because the climate crisis is such a huge, but sort of will require long-term transitions, right? We can't just phase out of oil tomorrow morning, right? And otherwise you create stranded assets. So you need to put in the resources that are needed, concessional resources, because we are also arguing that emerging and low-income countries should not get into further debt to fight the climate crisis. But the climate crisis today has become the education crisis, it has become the health crisis, it has become the food crisis, it has become the livable crisis, right, if we don't fight it. And so essentially, I think what we have not done a good job enough of yet, because we should do more of it, is to demonstrate, I think, to the international community, but also to the emerging market economies, that the climate crisis is the development crisis. If we cannot get development right, we will fail in the climate crisis. And if we cannot get the climate crisis right, we will fail with development. So essentially, we need to take these two things together. And whether you take energy security or water security, essentially, we're not going to do coal for energy security. We have to leapfrog into maybe battery energy storage. We have to do more solar. We have to do more wind. Some of it requires additional resources. Some of it requires new resources. And so within the system, I think that investment case for better growth, the investment case for stronger growth, is a climate case. But it has to be, I think, a case that makes sure that you don't create new monopolies, new islands of innovation that, exclude the rest of the world from that process of development. Because I think where we're hearing rejection is not so much because climate is crowding out development, it's because there is a sense that the climate space is being used to accelerate global development but leave everybody else behind. In sort of, the IRA is a big climate investment bill, probably the largest investment bill we have seen in the world. It's fantastic because what it is going to do, it is going to accelerate innovation. But I think what the rest of us are saying is, if you accelerate innovation, then we must have access to some of that technology so that we can actually trade with you. Because if on one hand you're accelerating your innovation and your technology and you're saying, my markets will only get this technology, this quality of technology, and I'm still so far behind, it's very difficult for me to see how I will compete or how I can compete. And so there has to be somewhere where we say, because it's a global problem, we should, it's a little bit like COVID. If we look at COVID and we look at climate, it is a global crisis. So you can't sort of save yourself and think you're going to be free. Because when it rains in Sao Paulo, it also rains in Cairo and it rains in Yaoundé. So essentially we are all struggling with the same problem.
But in practice, neither private nor public money is going into South African energy production, where you have power cuts in South Africa. Lots of different reasons for that. But international investors will not go near a predominantly coal-based power system.
But you see, this is the problem, because in some sense you do need to transition. And so if we say to South Africa tomorrow morning, you know, stop all your coal plants, what do we want South Africa to do? Stop growing? We create more poverty? No. What we need to say, and we have to acknowledge, they are hard to abate sectors. The hard to abate sectors will take a lot longer to transition. So you need the policies in place to start transitioning out of, so I think the UK this year is going to sort of close its last coal plant. They didn't do it. They could have done it 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 5 years ago. They didn't. So to expect South Africa, that has less technology development, to do it tomorrow morning, I think, again, that's where we talk about the principles of proportionality, and that South Africa needs the help. However, South Africa was one of the first African countries to actually start auctioning solar panels, and this is where then we need a just, transparent private sector that comes in and prices risk right. Because if you overprice risk, the South Africans are paying for energy in local currency. You're pricing risk in dollars. And so essentially, that risks price you out of the market, and South Africa cannot transition. So South Africa is investing its own resources in this energy transition. But even in South Africa, and Rania spoke a little bit about it, and you did as well, there is a reskilling of the people who we're going to take from the coal plants to, they may not necessarily be the same engineers that we will move into the renewable energy sector. We need to find, maybe they're going to go into green agriculture, maybe they're going to go into ocean agriculture. I think there is a comprehensive conversation that needs to happen. I know that the South African JETP has a lot of donors and development agencies in it, and we need to restructure it, but it has to be South African led, South African owned, and we have to listen to them, because they are on the ground, they understand the constraints of policy, of resources, and how they need to mitigate. I think the aspirations for growth for South Africa, everybody wants. The South Africans, first of all, first and foremost. And how they do it, I think, this is where I think country platforms work, when the country is in the driver's seat. Because if we listen to South Africa and how they want to go through this transition, of course, policies, national policies, macro policies, fiscal policies need to be in place for that to work effectively.
But, I mean, Esther, just, I know you've been sort of nodding, but it doesn't feel like, I mean, the international community, insofar as it, you know, is represented here and elsewhere, doesn't seem to be offering that kind of full spectrum, a fair spectrum to countries.
Exactly. I think when Rania was speaking, I think she mentioned something that for me is very important. I was in Rio Plus 20 when we were discussing the beginning of the SDGs, because the Millennium Goals, they are most for the low developed countries or developing countries. And then we say, with the climate, it has to be a global solution. And there are countries who actually who have done worse in terms of climate change, which of course are most developed countries, and they should pay for more. And this, when she mentioned the financial, she mentioned two things that I think are very important. The financial architecture that was not changing in order to actually finance the new development project that we need globally, and also the economic policies, and then you mentioned national economic policies in order to be able to push forward a new development project. So I think these two things are very important, and if you don't actually allow countries to have more policy space in order to do their own policies, thinking of how globally we can finance these policies, then we will be a problem. And if, of course, we're very far from that. And when we're saying this, SDGs we're 5 years from 2030, and we're not very close to that. So I think we have to both to do two things. How internationally we're going to finance this, and in order to finance more in developing and low developed countries, and how these countries will be able to have their own policy space in order to do the policy they have to do, pushing forward a new productive pattern. That's what we need, because if every human being would have the life patterns of a middle class in developed countries, we know the world would not be able to cope with the current productive pattern. So we have to have innovation. This innovation have to go globally. Everyone should have access. And one thing that, just to finish my talk now, that I'm not very let's say, optimistic on that, but I think we're here to discuss that, is when you saw, and I'll bring COVID again because what happened to vaccines? Something that everyone knows, that vaccine is something that everyone has to have in order for you to fight a disease that is globally. And even though we have a very hard trouble to get vaccines to countries who are not able to pay for it, which is something that, this is something that globally it's a threat for the whole global. And but as we know, even though we had death all over the world, who died more were the low incomes, the people who are most vulnerable. So even that, which was supposed to be something that would spread for all over the world, they affect differently. And that's what happened with climate change. Climate change affects differently. Most vulnerable people are much more affected. We have what we mentioned in Brazil. We have environmental racism in Brazil because people who are actually affected by climate change are usually more, black women are most affected. So we need to fight this, and we have to fight it globally, and to have policy space internal of the countries who are willing to do it, to change the development path in order to be a more sustainable, more inclusive. And I totally agree that to be sustainable, inclusive, although sustainable should be social, economic, and environmental, the social has to be inclusive in order to actually, we could move forward to a better pattern of development.
We're talking about the need for innovation, but also country leadership and financing. I don't know who wants to come in here. I guess a couple of things, because we're going to run out of time. I mean, the two big issues in this discussion, which are, again, feel rather sort of from previous eras, but they come back all the time because they're so central. You know, how important is IDA replenishment, international concessional lending by the World Bank replenishment, which is just being worked out or discussed now? How important is that to this process, even though we're talking about lots of new challenges? That's a very old programme. And also, is more active work needed on debt and debt reduction? I noticed, I mean, the WEF have their chief economist outlook, their quarterly chief economist outlook came today, and we have over half of chief economists seeing high public debt in advanced economies as a major risk. I would say it should be even higher, but 2/3 expressing similar concerns for developing economies. And we do know that public debt in emerging market economies is at a record as a share of GDP.
Yes. I could come in there, I think, quickly, and I'm so happy because normally we don't hear it that way, is that advanced economies have massive public debt. And the emerging market economies also have public debts that are above 60% and 70%. And so we're in this situation where advanced economies are struggling. We can see the financing issues. Emerging market economies, low-income countries are struggling. We have something called the SDRs, and Rania spoke about them, which is the special drawing rights. The special drawing rights can be issued by the IMF, essentially, to help with sort of pending crises which are systemic. And if we agree that the climate crisis is a systemic crisis, even though it's not sort of, we don't want it behind us before we issue the SDRs, we are arguing that you can issue the SDRs in anticipation, because every year that goes by where we don't have these additional resources, which today are not going to come from many of the sort of advanced public budgets, because those public budgets are tight. Where we do have another source of low-income, long-term resources. Yes, they are reserve assets. They first go to the central banks, but they can be monetized and used for fiscal and fiscal space purposes, or kept in the central banks and making sure that currencies, you know, can sustain any kinds of attacks. So I think there are what we need to find in a situation where the advanced economies that used to sort of underwrite some of this development no longer can in the way they did it, is new avenues for financing. So there's the SDRs, but there are also the carbon markets. And the carbon markets potentially today are a huge source of additional revenue if we were able to regulate it in a way where, you know, it worked well, it was orderly, there was high integrity. And I think we're still failing there as well. And as we fail there, we fail more the developing countries, but we also fail the large transition industries, the steel industry, those that are hard to abate, where, you know, the CEOs commit to net zero, but they will need to buy carbon credits to make sure that they can get to that. And I think these are two rather large sources of income that we could use and inject into the economies rather quickly and make it go forward.
Maybe just to follow up on the stage here at the UN, those two elements were discussed and discussed you know, jointly. The indebtedness of low-income, developing and middle-income countries, and a quantification of how much capital outflow to repay debt happened rather than capital inflow. So there goes the idea of how can you draw in private and foreign investment when actually you're repaying all of this. So that's number one. And then how can you tackle it innovatively? So we've heard debt swaps for climate action, debt swaps for biodiversity, etc. And then the idea of the debt sustainability analysis that is done and picked up by rating agencies. I mean, how can we distinguish between the different types of debt? Are we giving an equal weight to concessional debt the same way you're giving it to commercial debt? So these are real practical questions that, if addressed properly, might alleviate a lot of the pressure on emerging markets and also create the additionality. Because again, you started, Stephanie, by saying, is climate crowding out financing that's going for development? And that's why the points in the different reports is that this needs to be additional money, and that's where the SDRs come in very importantly. So indebtedness and the global financial architecture, its reform, both of them are coming hand in hand, or should come hand in hand. And I think that compared to a few years ago, we're knocking on open doors. This discussion is happening. It's happening in different initiatives, Bridgetown Initiative, G20. The IMF itself, in its 80 years, is also commissioning this as well. Surcharges for the first time are being addressed from the IMF side, which is an important cost for countries that access the IMF. So the other thing which I will end with is that finance is key if you're doing development across all SDGs, including climate. And for that, countries also need to do their role in trying to put together an integrated national financing framework, where you look at your domestic resource mobilization, where you look at concessional finance, where you look at trying to crowd in foreign direct investments and private investments. So it's as much as we're saying globally there needs to be solidarity, also internally there needs to be a balance and clarity with respect to your financing resources and the utilization of resource allocation.
And just a quick comment on the topics they are mentioning. I think one thing in terms of, we are now going maybe to a lower interest rate period. And this could be, if we do it properly, could be a good thing. If we prevent financial bubbles, if we prevent speculation with that, actually channel this. Because one thing about the level of indebtedness, you don't see the price of debt. So usually emerging countries, low developed countries has very huge interest rates compared to developed countries. So in the period of lower interest rates is a period that you can actually lower your payments of debt, and this could be a more financial space. But another thing is also the fiscal, how do you tribute? And I think that one thing that we are discussing in G20 is to prevent tax evasions from countries, because and the idea of having an international tax on the most rich people, like very rich people, in order to finance development. So I think when they're talking, this is both from the international level, how do you able to prevent financial bubbles and prevent speculation, but also internally, how you increase your tax burden in order to be able to finance your own development. So I think these two things are very keen, and to prevent tax evasion. So if this is something that is also to be an international consortium, let's say. And I think just a quick comment on the national strategies that I was mentioning before is this: you need to, in order to be able to do this, most countries would have to increase their tax. Yeah. Otherwise, they won't have money to finance themselves, and they have to look forward to some kind of international finance.
We have literally 1 minute left, and I'm going to get in trouble if we go too far over, but I just want to say very, very briefly, all three of you, massive focus on the US election, probably way too much focus on the US election, but it is definitely true that the US is not present and active in these conversations as much as in the past, and that's even been somewhat true of the Biden administration. So just very quickly, for each of you, how do we keep the focus, or what's the thing to focus on when there's all this concern about a lack of US leadership? Vera?
I think there has been US leadership on climate. And my sense is bringing the global world around on the climate conversation. We need to just keep that focus. We need to ensure that this leadership that the US has demonstrated on climate leads to innovation that is shared. Because I think if we can share that innovation, we will rise a lot more incomes up, and we will not need to talk a lot about debt, which is the other side of the conversation.
We worked very closely with the U.S. on our country platform, NWAFI. It was Secretary Kerry, so it was Egypt, U.S., and Germany, and we did. We provide a very good example that could be replicated. I think on innovation and technology transfer, this is where we need to see more of that. The World Bank report talks about the middle income trap, and for countries to move out of it, it's only through technology. But given the disparity when it comes to financing and the other urgent matters that countries have to deal with, given their space in financing, how can we make technology accessible so that we don't leave countries behind?
It's the final word.
Yeah, the final word is that our U.S., when it's growing, if it's also able to push many countries with it. So I think depending on the way you do it, it would be better for the rest of the world. But I know U.S., it's having a lot of trouble internally. And that's why it's the trade the trade barriers that we're just speaking about. This is something that we have to see, because otherwise it would be only internal matters, and then the rest of the world would be lacking this leadership.
Well, Esther, Rania, Vera, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to all of you for joining us for this session, which was part of the WEF's Future of Growth Consortium. You are free to go.